Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a great new deck for you. It is Soul of Windgrace, one of the most amazing landfall and land-centric commanders we've had in a long time. So if you don't know what he does, he is going to bring back a land from the graveyard when he comes into play or attacks. That's an awesome ability, but he also has 3 activated abilities. The first one costs 1 green, and it causes you to discard a land and gain 3 life. Second one is 1 colorless and a red, and you're going to discard a land and draw a card. And the third one is 2 colorless and a black, and it's going to give him indestructible and tap him, and you still have to discard a land. So it gives you a bunch of ways to get lands into your graveyard, to play around with that. It's a very nice toolbox commander that's going to give you a lot of great uses. You can draw cards, you can gain life, and it's also going to keep bringing back lands from the graveyard when you attack. So it's going to be difficult for our opponents to interact with and provide a lot of incremental value. That sounds exactly like my kind of commander. Dirtly, card draw included, and ramp included. So we're going to build around him with a bit of just kind of like a value recursion kind of land theme, because I really love that kind of dirtly gameplay. And without further ado, let's get started. And we're starting off with Ancient Greenwarden. This is going to be great with all of our landfall cards. It's also going to let us play lands from our graveyard, which is something our commander is doing anyway, but if our commander gets removed, we have another way to be able to do it, and it has a nice body on it as well. Avenger of Zendikar is one of the premier cards in any sort of landfall deck, and it's going to be particularly good here since our commander can keep bringing lands back from the graveyard, and we have a few lands that sacrifice to find other lands, such as fetch lands. This is going to make our tokens very big very quickly. Bane of Progress is really good in the deck since we're barely running any artifacts or enchantments. It's basically going to be a huge beater that acts as a one-sided board wipe, so I'm all for that. Beledros Witherbloom is just a value card. It can be substituted for something else more on theme if you want. I just really like it, and it's very good in this deck since we're going to have a lot of lands in play and a lot of ways to use the extra mana that this is going to give us. Braid's Arisen Nightmare is one that I've been trying to fit into a lot of decks as of late, and it's pretty good here. We kind of want our lands to go to the graveyard, so we are okay sacrificing land, and if our opponents want to sacrifice a land as well, that's great. We can also sacrifice some creature tokens or other things. There's just so many ways to break the symmetry with this in this deck, and it's a really sweet card. Brawn is one of the ways we're going to try to finish the game. We've got a few ways to discard it or mill it into our graveyard, but we're okay with it just dying naturally too. Once it's in the graveyard, all of our creatures are going to have trample, so that should be enough to get through for lethal. Cavalier of Thorns is a great way to ensure we hit our land drops and fill up our graveyard with more lands, and then when it dies we can exile it to put something from our graveyard on top of our library, so that's really solid as well. Not to mention that it's a 5/6 with reach for 5 mana, so just a great package on this card. Trainer Nightmare Adept is a good way to get some late game recursion. We can actually also discard lands to it to fill up our graveyard of lands, so it kind of hits 2 axes in the deck. Courser of Crufix is great in any land based deck. This is going to gain us some life and give us some virtual card advantage. Deathrite Shaman is going to be fantastic here. We're going to have a lot of land cards in our graveyard, so it's basically going to be a free way to ramp for 1 mana, and then it can also stop pinging our opponents or gaining us life late in the game. Just a great little value engine. Goblin and Archomancer is really good in any Gruul deck. We have a lot of green cards in here and a lot of red cards too, so this is going to provide a discount for like 60 to 70% of our deck, which is great. Greensleeve's Marrow Sorcerer is a new addition to landfall decks, and boy is this a good one. It's going to be huge when we have a lot of lands in play, and then it's going to give us a 3/3 anytime we make a land drop, but also it has 2 pretty relevant protections against planeswalkers and wizards. You might think that those don't come up very often, but there's a lot of creatures that are wizards in this game, so it can be surprisingly relevant. Kothoped's Soul Hoarder is one of the ways we draw cards. It's a fantastic card in Commander. We have a lot of ways to kill our opponent's stuff, and this is just going to get us a bunch of cards. Mina and Den Wildborn is a good way to make extra land drops. We can play an extra land with this every turn. We can also use it to give our creatures trample on demand and return some lands to our hand, which we can then discard to Lord Windgrace. So it kind of fits really perfectly in this deck. Morog, Fury of Akum is another of our finishers of choice. We have so many ways to make land drops, so this is going to be fantastic. Multani Yavimai's Avatar is going to be huge, seeing as it counts both lands in graveyards and on the battlefield for its size, so it's going to be really, really big in this deck. And then we can return 2 lands from the battlefield to our hand to bring him back from the graveyard to our hand, so he's very difficult to permanently deal with, and he also refills our hand for more Spirit of Windgrace shenanigans, so I really, really like this card in the deck. Olivia Mobilized for War is one that I've been wanting to play since I got it in the Secret Lair. and I think this is a good deck for her. We can discard those extra land cards to make sure that Soul of Windgrace has things to return from the graveyard, and we're also giving our creatures haste and +1/+1 every time we do, so it's win-win. Omnath, Locus of Rage, is going to make a bunch of 5/5s, and it needs to be answered basically immediately, or else it's going to just get out of control. And if they kill it or any of our other elementals, we get to bolt something for 3, so that's really, really good. Orcish Lumberjack is going to provide huge bursts of mana, and it's going to fill up our graveyard with lands for Soul of Windgrace to return, so it just hits every point very well in this deck. Rampaging Baloths is another great finisher for any landfall deck. It's going to make 4/4s. It's been outclassed lately, but even so, in this deck, it's going to work well enough that we're still playing it. Ramunap Excavator is a little bit more redundancy for that kind of effect of playing lands from our graveyard. Scavenging Ooze is going to provide us with a nice little bit of life gain and graveyard hate, which are both things that we need in this deck. Shakedown Heavy is another one that's not particularly on theme, but it's just a fun card and I really like it. You could play Oracle of Muldaya or something like that if you want to go more fully landfall. I really like this card. It's going to be giving us either a nice clock early on or some nice defense, or it's going to be giving us some card advantage. All of those we're pretty cool with. Spring Bloom Druid is Harrow on a stick. Harrow is obviously very good in this deck because it's going to fill up our graveyard with lands whilst ramping us. Sprouting Goblin is similarly good. We can pay the kicker to search for land and put it into our hand. We can then use that land to discard to Lord Windgrace. It's also just going to be good late game because we can start sacrificing our extra lands to draw cards, which is very, very good. Sylvan Safekeeper is another way to put lands into the graveyard. It's basically going to make all spot removal useless while he's in play. That's a really amazing ability, and people are probably just straight up not going to use it, so you're probably not even going to need to sacrifice lands, but if you do, they're lands that are still growing to the graveyard, which you're totally okay with. The Gitrog Monster is obviously one of the best cards in the deck. It's another of the best kind of land-based commanders, and it's going to just trigger so often in this deck with all the ways we have to put lands into the graveyard. Tilling Treefolk is a nice way to get back lands into our hand to reuse with Soul of Windgrace. Timeless Witness is going to provide us with some nice recursion. Talus Provisioner is a really fantastic card in landfall decks. It's mostly going to be used for the treasure generating ability, which is going to let us ramp pretty nicely. But late game, or if we're getting beaten down, it can be useful to gain some life with the food tokens as well. Tireless Tracker is also a fantastic card in this deck. It's going to make clues every time we have a land into the battlefield, and to top it off, whenever we sacrifice those clues, he's going to grow as well, so just great. Finally, Titania, Protector of Argoth, has many ways to be triggered in this deck, and she can also return a card when she enters the battlefield, so she's a little bit like Soul of Windgrace in that sense. She has to be answered very quickly, or the board is suddenly going to be filled with 5/3s that our opponent is going to have a lot of trouble dealing with. We're moving on to sorceries next, so we have Cathartic Reunion, just another good way to get lands into the graveyard and draw some cards. We have Crux of Fate, which is going to be a nice little board wipe that's going to deal with most things that we need to deal with. Culling Ritual is a good early game board wipe that's going to deal with all those mana rocks that our opponents might be playing, and we're not playing any of those, so it's not going to hurt us anywhere as much, and we're also going to get mana from it, so it can even be mana positive in the right situation. Decimate is a great bit of catch-all removal. Faithless Looting is a great way to filter through our deck and fill up our graveyard. From the Catacombs, I really like in this deck because it's a great bit of late game inevitability. We can cast it multiple times from the graveyard as long as we keep exiling stuff, and also the first time we play, when we take the initiative, we're going to get to search for a land card, so it's basically doing everything we want. Gaze of Granite is another great little board wipe. We're going to have so many lands that it should be easy to make this fairly one-sided. Life from the Loam is one of the best cards in the deck. It's going to keep dredging and recycling stuff, recycling those lands, filling up our graveyard, doing all the stuff that Jund decks love. Maelstrom Pulse is a great bit of spot removal that can also deal with token strategies very well. I like it because it has a lot of tokens in my meta. Painful Truths is a great draw spell that's going to draw us 3 cards very consistently. Tormenting Voice is another copy of Cathartic Reunion to just draw some more cards. And Worm Harvest is fantastic in this deck. When our graveyard is full of lands, we can keep discarding extra lands and make more and more worm tokens, eventually overwhelming our opponents. For instance, we have Abrupt Decay, which is good if your meta like mine has some blue decks that like to run counter spells. Beast Within is a great removal spell that goes in almost every green deck. Crop Rotation is great for searching up specific lands that we might need in certain situations, and it can also just put a land into the graveyard, which is very nice. Delayed Blast Fireball is another one-sided board wipe. Gorgori Charm I really like in this deck. It can pick off small creatures, which is fine. It can destroy enchantments, which is really good, and it can also regenerate our own team, which gives us protection against board wipes. Those three modes are very flexible and very good. It's great to have on a 2-mana instant. Grizzly Salvage is going to be fantastic. It's going to almost always give us what we need. We're going to be able to get a land or creature and then dump a bunch of cards into the graveyard. Usually you'll be taking a creature and then filling up your graveyard with lands, which you're totally fine with. Harrow and Roiling Regrowth are basically the same card, and they're just going to let us sacrifice a land to search up for basics. Murderous Cut is going to be a removal spell that's probably going to be quite cheap since we're going to have a fairly well-stocked graveyard most of the time. Tear Asunder is a really good exile-based removal that we can pay for 2 mana, or if we pay 4 mana, we can actually remove anything at all. So this kind of flexibility is fantastic. Tibbo's Trickery lets us interact a little bit on the stack. I like to have this in almost all of my non-blue decks because it's just nice to sometimes be able to deal with an instant or sorcery. And Windgrace's Judgment is going to be a very nice 3-for-1. We're going to be able to deal with the 3 most dangerous things on the board from our opponents. For enchantments, we have Druid class, which is really good in this deck. It's going to gain us a life whenever a land comes into the battlefield, and then when we upgrade it, we're going to be able to play an extra land each turn. Those are both amazing. Finally, we can make a nice big beater when we have some spare mana laying around. So all 3 of these modes are just going to be really good in the deck. Exploration is an expensive one. It's not essential, so feel free to substitute it for something else, but it's basically going to act like Oracle of Moldaya and give us an extra land drop every turn. And then finally, we're moving on to our lands. We have Balaged Sanctuary because it's nice to be able to have some more recursion. Bojuka Bog is going to allow us to deal with our opponent's graveyards. Cryptic Caves is a nice one because it can get itself in the graveyard and draw us a card. Hagra Broodpit is an excellent one because it's very flexible as a nice piece of removal that's also a land. Haunted Fengraf is another one that can put itself in the graveyard and return a creature when it does. Even though it's a creature at random, it's still some nice value. Malakir Maya is just always very good, and it's fantastic in this deck as a way to protect our creatures or get nice enter the battlefield abilities again, such as with Avenger of Zendikar. Strip Mine is going to allow us to deal with problem lands from our opponent, and seeing as we can recycle it with Soul of Windgrace, it's very strong in the deck. Tangled Veil is a great one that's going to double up as ramp when we need it to. Turn Timber will be mostly played as a land, but occasionally it's nice to have the option to play it as a spell too. And as a quick reminder, we are running a bunch of fetch lands in this deck because we do need ways to get our cards into the graveyard. We're also running some cycling lands. These are all very flexible. You can change it for anything more budget that fetches or cycles. Those are all very acceptable alternatives. And there you have it. That is our Soul of Windgrace deck list. What do you think about this deck? Do you like dirtly decks like this as much as I do? Please let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel since we're growing right now. And until next time, take care.